Welcome to the book, God's Hand on America. God's Hand on America, written by Medved. And so sit back and relax. I'm going to try to get through the first chapter. And first of all, I'll read from the first chapter. The title of the first chapter is His Sign, His Seal, His Promise. And before we get to it, we can read some quotes from some famous Americans. The first one is from John Adams in 1765. I always consider the settlement of America with reverence and wonder, as the opening of a grand scene and design in providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth. Now, the slavish part of mankind all over the earth, he must be referring to slaves. The word slave actually comes from when Romans had enslaved Slavic nationality, Slavic country. And America is pretty much the only country, or the first country, to start ending slavery throughout the entire world. All right, let's move on. The next one is Edmund Burt from 1791. As to great and commanding talents, they are the gift of providence. In some way unknown to us, they rise where they are least expected. Abraham Lincoln, 1840. If ever I feel the soul within me elevate and expand to those dimensions, not wholly unworthy of its almighty architect, it is when I contemplate the cause of my country. Woodrow Wilson, 1919. I, for one, believe more profoundly than in anything else human in the destiny of the United States. I believe that she has a spiritual energy in her which no other nation can contribute to the liberation of mankind. That sounds nice. It's true. This country changed the world, did it not? All right. There's a really nice picture here of a guy named William Henry Jackson exploring Wyoming's Teton Mountains in 1872, the year before his famous photograph of the Mount of the Holy Cross. A Gettysburg veteran, gifted painter and geological surveyor, he served as a technical advisor for the filming of Gone with the Wind and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And I'll put his picture up. He looks like a tough guy. The message of the mountainside. The message in the mountainside. His sign, his seal, his promise. Wonders, legends, and mysteries spurred American adventurers of every era to explore dark, remote corners of their continent. On rare occasions, miraculous rumors turned out to be true, shaping the young nation's mystical sense of itself. Such discoveries became especially important after the devastation of the Civil War, reassuring the weary populace that America maintained its special place in God's master plan. Then, as now, a bitterly divided nation by recent bloodshed and polarizing politics, longed for some unequivocal sign that providential protection still applied to this once favored land. Nature itself had spoken. As early as the 1840s, explorers in the Rocky Mountains heard persistent reports of one such sign, a colossal cross of snow that appeared for a few months each year on the flank of an uncharted Colorado peak. Indians, prospectors, and mountain men spoke in awe of this gleaming vision produced by the late spring thaw on a sheer rock cliff, largely obscured by surrounding pinnacles that equaled or exceeded its commanding height. According to the breathless accounts, the magical sight disappeared whenever wanderers approached too close to its sparkling magnificence. The first credible sighting of this elusive marvel came from a Massachusetts newspaperman who ventured west in an effort to restore his failing health. In August 1868, Samuel Bowles, the respected abolitionist, editor of the Springfield Republican, and a close friend of the poet Emily Dickinson, set out to tour the sparsely settled Colorado territory. Like other true believers in the sacred Union cause, he couldn't shake his post-war funk following the wrenching tragedy of Lincoln's assassination and the chaotic, disappointing steps toward racial justice and reconstruction. In the Rockies, Bowles hoped to rediscover his sense of wonder by climbing to the forbidding 14,000-foot summit of Gray's Peak. With 2 companions and a single pack mule, he ascended 15 miles and camped overnight in the brisk, starry mountain air before the next morning's final push through snowdrifts 15 feet high. After struggling over loose, treacherous rocks for the last mile, they came to a viewpoint that stirred their deepest emotions. It was not beauty, it was sublimity, Bowles wrote. It was not power, nor order, nor color. It was majesty. It was not a part. It was the whole. It was not man, but God. That was about before and in us. Mountains and mountains everywhere. Over one of the largest and finest, the snowfields lay in the form of an immense cross. And by this it is known in all the mountain views of the territory. It is as if God has set his sign, his seal, his promise there, a beacon upon the very center and height of the continent to all its people and all its generations. Despite this rapturous description, later published in his popular book, The Switzerland of America, Bowles left no indication of the mystical mount's precise location. Without a map or firm coordinates to recall the perilous path to the breathtaking view, travelers who attempted to retrace his steps found only frustration in their attempts to locate the sacred, solemn site the New England journalists had so memorably acclaimed. Finally, 5 years later, under the auspices of the United States Geographical and Geological Survey, an expedition secured lavish federal funding to the tune of $75,000 to expose the truth behind the phenomenon already labeled the Mount of the Holy Cross. Its intrepid leader, Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden, boasted a national reputation as a decorated Civil War doctor, university professor, and notorious unbeliever, celebrated for his previous exploration of the stunning landscape of Yellowstone. His new probe of the Rockies and its mythic religious symbol involved botanists, fossil collectors, mineralogists, topographical artists, scouts, philologists, cartographers, and geologists like Hayden himself. It also attracted a pioneer photographer named William Henry Jackson, who had trained as a landscape painter before fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg at age 20. After the war, he risked his life again to shoot the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad from the cowcatcher of a moving locomotive, and then accompanied Hayden on his celebrated journey to Yellowstone that inspired Congress to create the first national park. For Jackson, the desire to capture the first images of the cross in the mountainside became a professional obsession, as well as a spiritual quest. In this pursuit, he trekked into the Rockies with nearly 100 pounds of equipment on an aging, overburdened mule. The baggage included 3 cameras and heavy glass photographic plates of various sizes, some as large as 18 by 22 inches. These fragile panes had to be coated, exposed, and developed on site with no light metering equipment or predetermined emulsion speeds, requiring inspired guesswork from the explorer and artist. Breaking apart from the main body of the expedition, Jackson struggled with his bulky equipment and his bulky mule for 2 days of rugged climbing across Tennessee Pass and the Eagle River. Exhausted, he staggered across the shoulder of forbidding Notch Mountain to approach the fabled but still undocumented cross that Samuel Bowles had described. For most of the way, mist rising from the valley below blocked his sightlines, but the air began to clear as he continued his climb. I emerged above the timberline and the clouds, Jackson later recalled. And suddenly I clambered over a vast mass of jagged rocks. I discovered the great shining cross dead before me, tilted against the mountainside. The snow buried deep in the fissures of the dark gray rock glistened like polished silver in the mid-morning sun, refracting the light toward the slack-jawed photographer. Jackson stood and caught his breath, slightly contemplating the Holy Cross in all its sublime impressiveness, the marvelous mountain on which nature had drawn with mighty lines of snow the symbol of the Christian world. Jackson's weary colleagues straggled up behind him and witnessed a sudden signal that served to confirm the cosmic significance of their discovery. As they caught their first view of the spectacle, a gleaming rainbow shot into the cloudy sky, vaulting out of the thick, low-lying fog, framing the great cross and reminding them of God's covenant with Noah. As Yale professor William H. Gutzman described the scene in his 1966 book, Exploration and Empire, that rainbow's brief, eerily timed appearance represented one of those sublime moments so sacred to the 19th century romantic imagination. Trivial though it seems as a discovery per se, the Mount of the Holy Cross had meaning for all the many thousands who saw its various representations. To the religious mind of the day, it was worth as much as all the moving sermons delivered by Henry Ward Beecher. Nature itself had spoken. But for William Henry Jackson to capture that solemn pronouncement for prosperity, he first had to unpack his skittish mule, Hypo, and set up the complicated camera equipment. By that time, the rainbow had dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. The dank mist once more shrouded the face of the mountain. The determined photographer resolved to wait out the forbidding weather, spending a wet, shivering night near his cliffside. Perch, high on the slopes of Notch Mountain, struggling to keep both his soggy campfire and fading hopes alive. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a suitable blessing for Sunday, August 24th, 1873, the Lord's Day, of course. Jackson rose with the sun to seize his opportunity. He once more arranged his camera equipment and prepared the mountainside darkroom he would need to develop the image properly. Somehow, he managed to expose all 8 plates he had wrapped protectively for his climb, and with the largest pane of glass generated what his 1988 biographer P.B. Hales anointed the most famous image ever made of an American mountain. The photo of the Mountain of the Holy Cross, formally presented to Congress and to President Ulysses S. Grant, received wide distribution and caused a national sensation. It became the subject of thousands of reproductions, postcards, souvenirs, and even a U.S. postage stamp in 1951. A framed print of the world-famous photo made its way to Rome, placed prominently in the Pope's private apartment in the Vatican. The great shining cross there before me, tilted against the mountainside, the first photograph of the legendary Mount of the Holy Cross in Colorado, dubbed the most famous image ever made of an American mountain, captured under near impossible circumstances by William Henry Jackson on Sunday, August 24th, 1873. The chasm between reputation and immortality. This vision also inspired a friend of Jackson's to make his own trek into the wilderness to try to capture the grandeur of the now famous scene in an epic work of art. The British-born painter Thomas Moran had previously accompanied Hayden and Jackson on their expedition to Yellowstone, where he fashioned a series of celebrated canvases that colorfully conveyed the glories of the future national park. Moran hoped to achieve similar success in capturing the Mount of the Holy Cross, but the constant drizzly and cloudy conditions made it impossible for him to paint on site. Nonetheless, he managed a series of fanciful sketches In one draft, for example, he added a stairway of roaring cataracts at the base of the cross where none in fact existed. Moran remained single-mindedly committed in all his work to expressing the truth and meaning of each dramatic scene rather than recording realistic details. He went on to fashion his dramatic sketches into a gigantic masterpiece, 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide. This grand production became a wildly popular attraction that occupied pride of place at Memorial Hall, the central exhibit gallery of the Philadelphia Centennial International Exposition of 1876. To celebrate the first full century of American achievement, this dazzling World's Fair occupied 450 crowded acres in Fairmount Park and drew 10 million awestruck visitors from around the globe. An estimated 1 in 5 Americans made the pilgrimage to Philadelphia to honor the city where independence began, and to gasp at scientific breakthroughs like Alexander Graham's Bell, world-changing telephone, or the Remington #1 topographic machine, the first commercially successful typewriter. Fairgoers also turned a disproportionate amount of their hungry attention to Thomas Moran's indelible image of the miraculous and magnificent mountain in the wilderness. That image touched the happy hordes as freshly revealed evidence that God looked with special, clearly expressed favor on the works and ways of the new nation that celebrated its first glorious century of existence. Moran himself grandiloquently promoted the significance of the holy site. He had skillfully enhanced, declaring in the Centennial Catalog that the mountain of the Holy Cross is in some respects the most remarkable peak on the American continent. A New York reviewer, overwhelmed by the spiritual power of the prized canvas, solemnly concluded, "Beyond question, in the painting of this picture, Mr. Thomas Moran has made one of those exceptional leaps which bridge the chasm between reputation and immortality." This marvelous testimony to his sovereignty. Ernest Ingersoll, a tireless Harvard-educated naturalist and explorer, later summarized the profound impact that the Mount of the Holy Cross made upon the public consciousness. What matters it whether we write God in the Constitution of the United States, he asked, when here in the sight of all men is inscribed this marvelous testimony to his sovereignty? In his popular books and lectures, Ingersoll stressed the significance of the sign on the mountainside as an undesirable message from the Almighty. The cross of the Rockies served as the country's ongoing reminder of an unbroken covenant. And with Ingersoll's enthusiastic support, the Thomas Moran painting toured the nation and the world on exhibit in major cities throughout Europe and North America, eventually purchased by a wealthy Irish-Canadian physician. It became the proudest feature of his Manitou Springs mansion in Colorado. The estate went up in flames in 1886, but firefighters in a rescue deemed miraculous salvaged the famous canvas by cutting it from its frame, rolling it up, and passing it through an open window. Ultimately, the legendary work of art became the property of a Western legend of another sort, singing cowboy and Hollywood mogul Gene Autry, who added it to the permanent collection of his Western Heritage Museum. By that time, this mountain with the monumental symbol seared upon its side had become such an established feature of popular culture that the beloved poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow invoked it as a title of a moving, celebrated sonnet, The Cross of Snow. Captivated by a reproduction of Moran's painting in an expensive art book he had acquired, Longfellow compared the shimmering image with his changeless mourning for the young wife who had died before his eyes in a household fire many years before. There is a mountain in the distant west that, sun-defying in its deep ravines, displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my breast. These 18 years through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died. The mountain's mysteries. While Longfellow focused on the peak's poetic power, other Americans cherished its potential as a source of mystical healing. The first organized pilgrimage occurred in July 1912, when the Episcopal Bishop of Western Colorado performed a Holy Eucharist from the peak of Notch Mountain, where participants turned their gaze toward the giant cross, some 1,000 feet in height, less than 2 miles away. The snowfield to the right of the cross became the supplicating Virgin. For its suggestion of the Madonna reaching out in compassion toward the crucifixion. The deep pond that absorbed melting snow from the face of the sheer cliff won designation as the Bowl of Tears, to recall the chalice catching the blood of Christ. The meandering stream that descends from this small, still body of water became known inevitably as Cross Creek. Tourists visited the mountain in increasingly popular pilgrimages. Frederick Gilmore Bonfils, editor of the Denver Post, promoted and sponsored these faithful infused journeys with 200 devotees from 25 different states hiking to the summit of Notch Mountain in 1928. 2 years later, the Denver Post reported, "There is an unusual number of persons this year who are afflicted with serious maladies that have defied the best efforts of medical science. They hope that sight of the Holy Cross, coupled with firm faith in divine power, will accomplish cures." Certainly such cures have resulted from pilgrimages of the last 2 years. One frail 66-year-old woman who had been unable to leave her bed for 8 full years insisted that a horse and wagon haul her high enough up the mountain to catch at least one hopeful glimpse of the mystical symbol. After gazing at the marvel before her and praying for renewed health, she astonished her companions by walking back down the trail without aid or support. Such reports encouraged a charismatic Denver pastor to promise his ailing congregants that they would be healed if they faced the peak and knelt in prayer at the appointed hour, while he climbed the holy mountain on their behalf. Swamped with grateful assertions of cures following his return, he resolved to carry healing handkerchiefs with him on the next pilgrimage to benefit those too weak to make the trek themselves. By 1832, he had received more than 2 3,000 handkerchiefs from across the country and asked for assistance from the U.S. Forest Service in lugging the load to the top of Notch Mountain. There, they would receive the potent, site-specific blessing, with each of the assembled hankies dipped in the holy water, pooled in the greenish glacial runoff collected in the bowl of tears. Those who sought a more intimate encounter with the mountain's mysteries than a sanctified square of cloth continued to struggle with primitive roads and poorly maintained trails. Nevertheless, they trekked to the site each summer, visiting the only facility to accommodate such dedicated travelers on the southern ridge of Notch Mountain. A rude tiny cabin, assembled entirely of stone, known since the mid-20s as the Pilgrim's Hut. It provided shelter from the high-altitude chill and a facility for small groups to convene religious services, particularly on Sundays. The only window, a small opening in the rough rock wall, offered a view of the Holy Cross when mist and storms permitted. Despite the small numbers who took the trouble to approach the mountain personally, the government in Fairway, Washington, still took notice of the peak's enduring hold on the national imagination. In his first 2 months in office, President Herbert Hoover used his executive power under the Antiquities Act to declare the Holy Cross National Monument. 5 months later, the stock market crashed, and the nation began sliding toward the Great Depression, depriving the federal bureaucrats of the funds they needed to develop the attraction as planned. Hoover's successor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, did manage to dispatch 200 youthful workers from the Civilian Conservation Corps to build a log lodge at the cost of $120,000, but it wasn't enough to sustain the pilgrimages during economic hard times and the gathering war clouds in Europe and Asia. In 1934, the tally of midsummer pilgrims reached its all-time high of 3,000. That number declined precipitously in the face of bureaucratic neglect and dwindling enthusiasm by the local press, especially after the death of Denver Post editor Bonfils, the site's most fervent promoter, in 1933. The fabled and fallen cross. As the number of visitors fell off, so did a crucial element of the cross itself. Its right arm collapsed in rock slides or avalanches at some point after 1941. Because snow covers all the mountain for much of the year, and few climbers ever attempted close-up inspections of the huge fissures that shaped the cross, the exact moment of its demise, like so much else about it, remains a mystery. One theory blames the U.S. Army, which established Camp Hale nearby for winter warfare and mountain combat training in World War II. This facility directly abutted the boundary of the National Monument and, according to persistent rumors, authorized firings of artillery on a few occasions that inadvertently ruined the right arm of the famous cross. A 1968 investigation of Army records produced no evidence to support such a speculation, but the photographic record shows an unmistakable deterioration of the symbol during the war years. In any event, no subsequent image by any photographer ever showed the cross with the vivid, startling clarity of William Henry Jackson's first rainbow heralded image of 1873. Ironically, Jackson himself may have outlived the natural wonder he did so much to popularize. He worked well into his 90s and finally succumbed at age 99 in June 1942. For those who continue to ascribe supernatural power to the mountain of the Holy Cross, it's worth noting that the three deeply devoted true believers who did the most to emphasize its significance all led unusually long and richly rewarding lives. 89 years for Thomas Moran, 94 for Ernest Ingersoll, and nearly a century for Jackson. None of them lived long enough, however, to protest the decision by Congress to strip the mountain of the Holy Cross of its national monument status in August 1950. In a quietly enacted cost-cutting measure, the people's representatives reassigned the mountain from the purview of the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior to the less restrictive supervision of the Forestry Service and the Department of Agriculture. Even the superintendent of Rocky Mountain National Park supported the downgrade because he claimed that fewer than 50 people visited the monument in the course of any year, and it would cost pilgrims a climb worth half your life to ascend Notch Mountain to catch the disappointing view of the fabled, now fallen, cross. In their intervening decades, few voices have demanded new attention for the symbol in snow that once caused such an intense national sensation. After all, today's secularized society expends far more energy in protesting crosses on public land than on protecting them. Even in an era of rampant conspiracy theories, no one suspects human agency in any of this. How could some secret society or devious hoaxer claim credit for either making or marring the religious imagery dramatically identified, then desultorily disregarded on a craggy peak some 14,000 feet above sea level? But it seems odd, if not utterly amazing, that a mere 75 years after Samuel Bowles first described the cross and hailed its immortal importance, that sign, seal, and promise had been swallowed up by the same grinding ice and rock that had created it in the first place. Bowles once reverently proclaimed the site as a beacon upon the very center and height of the continent to all its people and all its generations. But a mere 2 generations later, that beacon no longer illuminated the landscape. This strange tale of the disappearing symbol parallels the deeper, more disturbing story of the nation's dissolving faith in its own divinely ordained destiny. To those inclined to find significance in omens and portents, the message from the mountainside seemed unmistakable. Just as some vast power had once carved a benediction, that identical force now engraved a warning of collapse and confusion. God bless America. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. I think it's quite amazing. Before World War II, people talked about God's protection on this country quite a bit. After World War II, it wasn't like people stopped believing, they just didn't talk about it as much. Michael Medved has another book called The American Miracle, which I may do after this book. And I have another book called 100 Bible Verses that created America. So we have several choices to go to, and I hope you keep listening to these. I think it's very interesting. Let me talk about Thomas Jefferson for a second. You know, when I talk to people about God's hand on America, a lot of them, and the forefathers, you hear the forefathers brought up, and these people who want to argue with you always say, well, Thomas Jefferson wasn't a Christian. He had different religious views, but he never questioned the higher power. Never. He respected the Bible. And I'm going to quote from our third president, Thomas Jefferson, in his inaugural speech. Even though he was called an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics, the third president nonetheless praised the nation in his first inaugural speech address, and I quote, acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence, which by all of its dispensations proves that it delights in the happiness of man here and his greater happiness hereafter. So Thomas Jefferson definitely believed in God and heaven, and he also said this: kindly separated by nature and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc of 1/4 of the globe, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the 1000th and the 1000th generation. So he liked quoting the Bible. He's the one that wrote in the Constitution, all men are created equal. He was definitely a God-fearing man. He just had a little bit different views. After the Civil War, Lincoln was reelected, and in his second inaugural speech, he said that the blood of the hundreds of thousands of people, over 600,000, I believe, died for freeing slaves. And he said that blood was an atonement for the long-standing sin of slavery. So according to Abraham Lincoln, the blood spilt during the Civil War is our atonement for the sin of slavery as a country. And then the day he was shot and assassinated was Good Friday. And the country as a whole looked at Lincoln's assassination as redemptive and unifying martyrdom. I would recommend reading this book, man. It's awesome. What a story. I never heard of it. Anyway, God's hand is on America. And in the next video, I'll read chapter 2, North to the Future. God bless you.